not say. But I don't know if I'll take 20 minutes, but I'll say a few things. The first thing that I want to say is that the interview that comes at the end of the book, which was published in Frontline, is the only piece of writing that is done actually for the Indian readership. The both other essays, which originally were published in Socialist Register, were written very much for an international audience, international readership, including, of course, the readership in India that reads things like Socialist Register. I bring this up partly because the main text on which the book itself is takes the title of that essay on India, liberal democracy, and the extreme right. Because it was written essentially for a foreign audience, goes over a lot of material that I may not have included in this form had I written it for an Indian readership. So some of it in that sense. At the same time, I must say that that particular essay itself came at a particular point that I'll talk to you about. But I've been writing on the issue of communalism and creeping right-wing extremism in India since 1992, since the Babri Masjid demolition area. And it was at that time in my essay entitled On the Ruins of Ayodhya that I basically formulated the perspective which I have been developing over the years. So I have published some 10, 12, I forget how many essays since then. And what has happened then is that as new events occur and as I revisit my own thoughts, I keep modifying the propositions that I had put forward in the early 90s, late 90s. This essay was written in response very much to the elections of 2014, which brought Modi to power. And the immediate concerns that I had, which I wanted to spell out, was, first of all, I felt that those elections indicated the terminal decline, irreversible decline of the Congress party, a party that had dominated Indian politics for over a century, had arrived at a point from where I thought it was not going to recover in any foreseeable future, maybe never. That I thought was a very, very, very important turning point in India. The other thing that I had been watching before writing this essay was that despite the Gujarat pogroms and despite everything else that Modi had done, he had increasingly become the favorite prime ministerial candidate, both for the big corporate bourgeoisie. In fact, I do not remember the Indian big bourgeoisie coalescing together behind any one prime minister quite as strongly as they did behind Modi, even before he got elected. In fact, their support was extremely important for his getting elected. But also that for years before the 2014 elections, the polls being taken in things like India Today and Outlook and so on that were being published were indicating that Modi was emerging as the leading candidate to become the Prime Minister of India. I assume that journals of this kind, their polls indicate very heavily how the urban middle classes are thinking. The well-heeled urban middle classes are, I think, the ones they really poll. So what was emerging by the time the elections came was that Modi had become the unrivaled candidate from premiership for India for the rule of property in India. All scales of property had coalesced behind him. I also felt at that time that the Vajpayee dispensation in the past was a transitional moment for the Sangh Parivar, in which they wanted to establish themselves the legitimacy as a party of rule and would play by and played very much by the rules of liberal democracy. Now, my feeling was that this was going to be increasingly more and more an RSS government. And that the BJP, of course, itself is actually a very well-oiled political machine. And at the same time, it is also a political front among other fronts of the RSS. And that the coordination among the various fronts had been very impressive, diabolically impressive, but very impressive the way various fronts were functioning. So that in that particular article, I also had to sort of fill in some of the background for the RSS and so on, which all of us in India are very familiar with. But that was a historic moment. I thought it was an absolute turning point in Indian history. And at that time, very few of my friends and comrades agreed with me that the Congress was now terminally ill and it was not going to come back to power. And therefore, my prediction was that this BJP RSS rule is going to be there for quite a while, is going to be stable. It was going to be the party of rule, and slowly and gradually the full program of the RSS would be implemented. Slowly and gradually. I also felt that in the way the extreme right had emerged all over Europe and the United States, India was going to get a lot, Modi's India was going to get a lot of support from the United States. And that no matter what they do to the minorities or intellectuals or activists or whatever, they were not going to face too much pressure from around the world. So it was in that sort of moment that that article was written. I had in my mind the idea that what was happening in India was very much a part of what was happening in the world at large. And the essential background for the rise of the what I call extreme right and I'll come to this phrase, extreme right, if I remember. I think the essential background to it is actually the defeat of the communist states, the dissolution of the USSR. It's a historic turn, not only in India, but all over the world, the rise of the right and the left being very much on the defensive everywhere else in the world. That issue of what the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Allied states has meant for us actually comes up much more in my other essay on nationalism and extreme capitalism. I want to say briefly a word about this term. I just realized today that both my articles use the word extreme in its titles. I never realized it. When Perry Anderson read my India essay, he said, but you have not defined what you mean by extreme right. My answer to that is that this is a right which is not only deeply anti-communist, not only deeply connected to rule of property and all that, but it is precisely the fact that it combines its institutional work within the liberal democratic framework with relentless use of violence against very many very many social forces, minorities, of course, particularly, but not only the minorities. So it is that combination, what I have said in my articles, that what we are dealing with is the emergence of a very new kind, very different kind of state all over the capitalist world, more or less, a great many places in the capitalist world, which combine the institutional framework of liberal democracy, as well as some of the salient features of what we know as fascism. So it's a sort of a combination of the two. And of course, what is likely to happen in India and what we are witnessing is that the balance between liberalism and fascism is shifting. It is becoming more and more illiberal, what the Hungarian head of state calls illiberal democracy, and all that. This essay, the essay on India, liberal democracy and the extreme right, it was actually reprinted in India a couple of places before, including Frontline, before you put it together in this book. Hello. Sorry. But the other essay has not been published in India like that. So I'm very glad that you have made it available to the Indian readers at a price that many people can actually afford instead of what Socialist Register costs and so on. So I'm very pleased about that. There again, there were 2 or 3 different issues that I was asked to address. Leo Panich, who edits Social Scientist, said that we are going to do an issue on the rise of the right across the world, and can you give us an overall essay that will speak to the phenomenon entirely. But when I got the message, there was a lot about nationalism and neoliberalism and so on. So One problem is that in the West now, the word nationalism is taken to be entirely an absolutely right-wing obscurantist position and so on and so forth. In India, of course, we have historically associated nationalism with anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and so on. So that had to be clarified for a Western audience that there are progressive nationalism, there are progressive nationalism, there are fascism is a nationalism, national liberation movements of the communists are also national, and so on. So the whole issue of nationalism was addressed briefly in that article. The other thing, going back to something I just said a little earlier, throughout the West, whatever left there is in any Western country, all shades of it are included in what I'm going to say. None of them ever understand what the cost to progressive causes or the cost to people's movements or the cost of to the revolutionary movements in the world has been of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Throughout Western left, there's a complete indifference to what it has meant for revolutionary movements in the rest of the world. And so that one of my major emphases in that essay was that neoliberalism itself could not have succeeded nearly as well. It could not have lasted nearly as well, except in the perspective of the consequences of the defeat of the communist state system. It is what happens to the working classes. The working classes of the formerly socialist countries were left with completely no security, no employment, this, that, and the other. And essentially what happens is that an immensely large working class from the socialist countries, formerly socialist countries, becomes available for super exploitation, which then leads to the great fall of the wage rate around the world, which then leads to a much higher level of accumulation for the 1%, as they're called, for the great big corporate bourgeoisie of the advanced capitalist countries. So I spent quite a bit of time talking about that, essentially having an argument with Western left. We in India understand very much what it has meant for people of the tricontinent. But there is an actual very material relationship between the success of neoliberalism, the rise of this far right. It is only because the communist state system was defeated that the bourgeoisies of all countries in the world are hell-bent to take back from the working classes everything that the working classes had won over the last 100 years. So the class offensive is so immense. What they talk about, economic crisis, this, that, and the other, is the crisis of the working classes, of the working people, of 90% of people who are suffering from it. The big capital is having a grand time. This kind of redistribution of wealth, undoing the gains that the working classes had made over 100 years during the period of communist ascendancy, is in fact the actual background for the rise of the far right. The interview was conducted just before the elections of 2019, but then published after it. We can talk about that. I think I've talked long enough, longer than I thought I would. Thank you very, very much.
I thank Professor Aijaji for explaining about this book. And now I would request Sri N. Ram Garu to review the book.
I can't hear
you. Your mic is unmute, N. Ramji. Please mute. Remove the mute. On the mic. Your mic and N. Ram sir.
Yeah, only
okay,
now.
Okay, now okay.
You have one.
Good. Okay. Good.
Yes. So thank you, Nava Telangana Publishers, for bringing this out and giving us an opportunity to discuss these extremely important issues that Professor Aijaz Ahmed has given us. I have
Please increase little voice, sir. Increase the voice little.
How do you agree? Okay, I'll speak up. Can you hear me? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
I can.
I have long been deeply interested in the writings and thought of Professor Aijaz Ahmed, whom I regard as one of the most important Marxist intellectuals of our times. He is known as an accomplished literary and cultural theorist, productive, widely published political commentator. But for me, although he doesn't, I think, consider himself a journalist, I think that he has contributed some of the finest journalism of our time, particularly in the long form. I've said much of this in the introduction to this book, introduction to the two important essays, and also to the interview that was published in Frontline. Although I've said this in some detail in the introduction, let me, for those who haven't yet seen the book or read the book, draw from that some of the important traits of this book of Aijaz Ahmed's writings, and in particular these essays. First point I want to make in this review is that sustained engagement with Marxist theory endows his major writings with the power of abstraction. This is extremely important, I think, because this enables him to explore deep theoretical issues set in complex historical circumstances with clarity and sure-footedness. In the 90s, Professor Amartya Sen once asked me, "Have you read In Theory?" It was brought out in 1992. I said no, and then he said, "You should." So In Theory, Nations, Classes, Literatures is a very important book and perhaps the best known work of Aijaz Ahmed. The Marxist examination of the role of theory and theorists in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements. And it is an important critique of and also a polemic against some influential strands of post-colonial thought and theory. In particular, it takes on attempts to pass off cultural relativist theorizing as part of the left. And I think It is this theoretical grounding combined with a logical mode of argument and exposition. This is on classical lines. And a refreshing boldness in deriving new formulations for them. It's these that invest. His essays written in the 1990s, some extremely interesting essays. I'll single out Fascism and National Culture, reading Gramsci in the days of Hindutva. Mind you, reading Gramsci in the days of Hindutva. Then a very important essay on the ruins of Ayodhya, communalist offensive and recovery of the secular, and also right-wing politics and cultures of cruelty. These, I think, although written in the 90s, have enduring value. I would regard them as baseline texts. But as Ijaz himself mentioned earlier, these essays also is open, there's a certain openness to conceptual refinement, modification and correction, which is one of the most attractive qualities, I think, in Ijaz Ahmed's major writings, that is open to, modification, adjustment, correction, which is, I think, at the heart of the scientific method in science. And this results from further reflection, debate, and observation of how the practical situation develops. I think the approach to the question of fascism, the contemporary Indian and international context, is a prominent example of this openness, which I again repeat is one of the most attractive qualities of this writing, and it signals great intellectual integrity, transparency, because he gives you a look into how he has arrived at these conclusions, and if there is a change, how he's very open to discussing these issues. And it is the same theoretical grounding that gives weight or heft to Ijaz's political commentary. And as I said earlier, it lifts it well over the ordinary. I doubt that he considers himself a journalist. He certainly has said he's not a student of day-to-day electoral politics, but he's adept at analyzing and unraveling the significance of current affairs with a refreshing originality, boldness, and persuasiveness. I've had a long and close association with Ijaz Ahmed, particularly when I was editor of Frontline and even after that. And I looked into it, and between June 1997 and June 2020, he contributed 84 articles, many of them essays in the long form. And of course, he's also published elsewhere in Socialist Register and so on. And some of the most interesting of these essays are on the ascendancy of the extreme right in India and elsewhere, on Lenin and the imperishable legacy of the October Revolution, on the world significance of the vision of Fidel Castro, whom he calls the last of the great revolutionary figures in the political tradition traceable to 1917, and on the moral grandeur of Nelson Mandela's universalist vision of equality. And there's much more there, but I want to call attention to the quality of this steady flow of long-form journalism, of gravitas, of relevance, and great, contemporaneity and the highest quality. Now, coming to the essays included in the book, brought out by Nava Telangana Publishing House, 2 long-form essays. He's already spoken about it, and I think they are of compelling interest to the left, but not only to the left, going well beyond the left to all those who are concerned about the advances made by the extreme right. When I read these essays, I didn't have the kind of clarity that I think we have now on what is the extreme right, and also about its highly destructive ideology, policies, and programs. And also it gives you insights into what needs to be done to reverse this trend. And I think it is this challenge that the first essay, written in Actually, 2000, in the summer of 2015, published in Socialist Register in 2016. The introduction, I've given the original source and so on, and republished in Frontline in 2019. The fact that an essay written in 2015 was republished in 2019 and is of great interest in 2020, I think shows that it is a deep and conceptually stimulating examination of
And Ramji, we can't hear. Just please.
It's muted on big blue button.
Yeah, I didn't mute it. Something wrong with the technology.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't need to mute when I'm speaking. Anyway, going back. So how much of this has you missed? How many minutes?
Just the last few seconds before we caught you.
Thank you. So this essay, India, Liberal Democracy and the Extreme Right, I think is of great importance for us. It's relevant even today, although it was written in the summer of 2015. It's of great interest even today. And that is because it's a deep and conceptually stimulating examination of what he calls, Ijaz Ahmed calls, a formidable claim made by Indian liberalism. And he sets it out without caricaturing it or making light of it at the outset. And the claim is, and that's very, very important, I think, when we talk about the book, because a lot of people believe or used to believe in it. The claim is that the republic is grounded in an elaborate and ideologically hegemonic liberal democratic institutional framework, that all political forces of all colors are forced to consent to this framework. In other words, whatever they say in opposition, once they come to power, they are forced to stay within the four corners of this framework. And therefore, they have to play by the electoral democratic rules. And the argument used to be, or the claim used to be, that they gravitate towards the liberal center and so on. This is a persuasive claim, it is a plausible claim, and it needs to be taken on head on. And it is this plausibility, Ijaz Ahmed contends, that gives liberalism's claim its persuasive power. And as against this claim's plausibility and the durability of its persuasive power, he reflects on, reflecting on the basic trajectory of Indian politics over the past quarter century, specifically between 1990 and 2015, he comes up with two major theses that forms the core of this first essay. And the first thesis is, it's not so much the right that moves closer to the center. It's the liberal center that keeps moving further and further to the right. Secondly, the second one is, this is a historically unprecedented process, an ongoing process, seemingly unstoppable rise of the extreme right to dominance in vast areas of national life. I'm quoting here, and that is in culture, society, ideology, economy. Although with a commitment to observe virtually all the institutional norms of liberal democracy. You can raise the question today, considering what happened in Parliament and many other events or actions by the ruling party at the center, headed by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, whether they are now trying to breach some of these norms of liberal democracy. Whether that's happening now, that's a question for all of us to consider. And in particular, I would be interested in what Aijaz Ahmed and also Vijay Prashad have to say on this question, whether it's moving away from what is described here. So this attempt to capture state power not through frontal seizure, as in revolutions or counter-revolutions, but from within, I think he talks about it, features a long will to a long march, through the institutions. And and another important point he makes, this goes hand in hand with what he calls the punctual uses of violence, use of violence as a strategic imperative. This means unleashing sporadic large-scale violence, as we saw during the Gujarat pogrom, and more frequent low-intensity violence, which can then be kept out of general view because the media are not playing their role through media monopoly and manipulation, and with the mutual agreement between liberalism and the far right. So this leads to a theoretically interesting question. Is there really an irreconcilable, and in Marxist terms, I would say antagonistic, contradiction between institutions of liberal democracy and takeover of the state by the extreme right? Is there really an antagonistic contradiction between institutions of liberal democracy and takeover of the state by the extreme right? And I think this is an very important issue. And also what he says about the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, I think his analysis of the extreme right with its intricate multi-layered networks assigns primacy to the RSS, and the BJP gets only a secondary place, although it's a mass political party and so on. I think what he says here is extremely interesting, and also on the rise of Narendra Modi. Second essay, Extreme Capitalism and the National Question, is a predominantly theoretical exploration of the complex and often misunderstood relationship. I think this is a fascinating essay for anyone interested in theory. Often misconstrued relationships between nationalism, liberalism, neoliberalism, and globalization. And I think you have to read this essay very, very closely. He doesn't hand over its highlights on a plate to anybody, and it's not for the surface skimming reader. It has to be read very closely. This is not to say it's not accessible. It's well worth the effort, but the reader has to work on it to understand the argument in this, I think, extremely interesting essay. And in particular, he takes us through the promiscuous use of the term nationalism, takes issue with the contemporary discourses on the left and in the corporate media that see nationalism as being intrinsically opposed to neoliberalism and globalization. He critiques the promiscuous use of the term nationalism, and very, very important for me, he sets down here in the second essay the building blocks of his working hypothesis. He says he's held this working hypothesis for about a quarter century. And there I think I'd like to quote from this part of the essay. He says, and this is, I think, great interest to all of us, there is no such thing as nationalism per se, with an identifiable trans-historical essence over and above particular historical practices and projects. So nationalism today is the reflection in thought of the fact that nation state either exists in the world of material relations, he's already mentioned that, or sought to be obtained in the future, and so on. So nationalism can serve all sorts of purposes, ranging from the extremely reactionary to the radically emancipatory. And he also makes the point that the term right-wing nationalism is used to cover such a wide range of political phenomena as to be virtually useless as a designation. And I think it takes us through historically specific situations such as nationalisms in Britain, across Europe, in India, in Turkey, and elsewhere. And he puts spade to the idea, to the assumption that these nationalisms are opposed to all the available evidence. He cites the nexus between Hindutva, nationalism, big capitalist, US imperialist designs, and what he calls the sturdy neoliberal structures that have gone from strength to strength. Likewise, Erdogan's authoritarian offensive defined Turkish national peculiarity in Islamist terms, goes hand in hand with his open embrace of neoliberalism, his pursuit of full membership of the European Union for Turkey, and his decision to remain, that Turkey shall remain a loyal member of NATO and a loyal all-weather ally of the US, to quote Ijaz Ahmed. And on the second question, while there may be a temporal coincidence between neoliberal dominance in several capitalist countries and intensification of globalizing processes, there is no structurally necessary correlation between neoliberal thought and policy prescriptions on the one hand, and the long-term historical process of globalization of capital on the other. And you will also note that there's a very interesting discussion. I wouldn't say digression because it's quite important to the essay on China as a major case here. And I think this is a matter that can be debated, but it's an extremely important insight that is provided in this essay on what is happening in China. That in his view, while the Chinese government has embraced globalization with vigor and in full measure, it has embraced neoliberalism only partially, picking up only certain policies out of the whole package, rejecting others, while safeguarding the leading role of the state and its control of the main financial architecture. These neoliberal policies which have been adopted can be modified, can be restricted, even reversed, depending on the practical results of an ongoing process. So he makes certain formulations here. The crucial fact is that it's not the Chinese bourgeoisie as we now know it that has created the Chinese state, even as we now know it. It is a Chinese socialist state that has constructed the economic structure which has made the rise of the bourgeoisie possible, hothouse fashion, quoting Karl Marx, in another context, in another historical context. So this question, I think, has to be looked at. The other important formulation that he makes is that I think this is a memorable formulation. Also, the literary style in which it's written should be noted. And I quote here, neoliberalism, says Ijaz Ahmed in this essay, is so combative a partisan on behalf of capital and against labor that it needs a permanently strong state to mobilize all its apparatuses, from the repressive to the ideological ones, to maintain the neoliberal order. Then he goes on to say that neoliberalism weakens the state. That neoliberalism weakens the state is an ideological fiction. When globalized neoliberalism, what globalized neoliberalism wants is a state that is weak in relation to capital and ruthlessly strong in relation to labor. So neoliberalism doesn't weaken the state. It is weak in relation to capital, ruthlessly strong in relation to labor. And he's also, you will note that in another essay, in another interview by Vijay Prashad, which appeared, which was in NewsClick, he makes the point that class structures cannot be reproduced without beating people into habits of obedience. And then he says, the most authoritarian thing in the world is capital. Extremely important statement, I think. So on, there are other things in this essay, including the role of US imperialism today, and it can be read in the book. I've also summarized in the introduction. The interview itself is wide-ranging. The interview is very different in character or form from an essay. And a good interview makes important ideas more accessible. And I think Gibson John and Titish PM have taken Ijaz across a range of subjects he has written about and questioned them on these issues so that it is both clear and wide-ranging and so on. So that is also worth reading. I think this is a very small selection from Ajaz Ahmed's extensive writings and reflections, but it speaks powerfully to the present. I think it really helps us make sense, theoretical as well as empirical, of what has been going on in the political economy of India and in other parts of the world as well, in particular over the past quarter century. I've taken quite a bit of time, but I think a review requires highlighting some of these aspects. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Enramji. We are also happy to inform that his book is available on Amazon and Flipkart. And this book is distributed throughout the India. Especially this book is available at Leftward, Delhi, Navatelangana, Prajashakti in Andhra Pradesh, Bharati Pusthakalayam, Tamil Nadu, Chinta, Kerala, National Book Agency, Calcutta, Kriya, Bangalore, and we have given number of copies to IPD Alternatives to distribute it all the capital cities of North India. So this book is available. We request the viewers also, and we suggest the people to readers to purchase this book. We thank everyone. And now finally, I would like to I would request Vijay Prasad ji, the editor, Leftward, to discuss on the theme of the book in the today's India's context.
Okay. First, I want to congratulate Navatelangana, comrades Vijay Rao and Chandramohan, for bringing out a book in the middle of a pandemic. It's not an easy situation. Our publishing network has struggled. Comrade Chandramohan has mentioned a list of fraternal publishers. I request viewers and others to support our publishers, whether it's Chinta in Kerala or National Book Agency in Bengal, Leftward, of course, and Bharati Pusthakalam, Kriya. I mean, we should keep naming them, Comrade Chandramohan, because we need people to understand that they need to support left books, and there is no substitute for the discourse of the left at a time when the right is basically, damaging our thinking so deeply. There is no substitute, and I very much hope people will support our publishing ventures. Before I get into this book, I'd just like to say that on the 9th of October, Leftward and all our publishing houses, Navatelangana, Prajashakti, Kriya, Chinta, etc., will be releasing a free volume of Che Guevara's 2 texts. One is a text called Letter to the Tricontinental, and secondly, Socialism and Man in Cuba, with an excellent introduction by Ajaz Ahmed. That will be a free PDF available in 23 languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, of course, Gujarati, and, mustn't forget Telugu. So that's one thing. And then not long from now, in a few months, Leftward will produce a book by Ajaz Ahmed called Nothing Human is Alien to Me, which is a very long interview, which begins, and people will be interested in this, in the early years of a very young Ajaz Ahmed, and what kinds of things he read as a young boy and carries forward to the present day. So that book will come out perhaps in a month or so. I encourage you to look for that. There are a couple of questions that I want to raise, and I think I'll just raise them in a bundle, Ajaz, if that's okay. I'll raise them together, and then perhaps you could come back and make some comments about them. There are some themes in the book, and I think Ram has laid them out excellently. It's an excellent discussion of the main themes in the work. But there are 2 threads that I want to pull out from these essays, but also, your larger work. The first is in the first essay on liberal democracy and the extreme right. There's a point you make which I find requires some more discussion. You say that extreme capitalism, somehow there is a move, you say, of the liberals to the communal and neoliberal right. In other words, there is a kind of collapse of liberalism, not just in India. There is a collapse of liberalism, perhaps globally. Now, by collapse of liberalism, I think we need to understand this in a few forms. One is a collapse of the liberal project, the defense of constitutions and the defense of rights and human rights and so on. There's a corruption of liberalism with motives of imperialism. For instance, one sees groups like Human Rights Watch operating largely as an adjunct of the US State Department. What is the nature of the liberal project now? And then organizationally, it appears that liberalism doesn't any longer have a coherent organizational form. It seems to be very much within the same terrain as what in many places we would call the far right. Is the Conservative Party in Britain an organizational form of liberalism? Doesn't strike me as anything like that. Is the Labour Party an organizational form of liberalism? I'm talking now just of the UK. Doesn't strike me as that. So one question is, what is the project of liberalism today? And secondly, what's the organizational form? Because in the Indian context, doesn't strike me that the Congress Party any longer or ever was the organizational form of liberalism. I mean, after all, the Congress Party pushed the country's federal constitution increasingly in a centralized direction. President's Rule 356, the Congress had it not in the back pocket, but it was in the front pocket. Anytime they didn't like anything, dismiss the government. Recall at the beginning, Kerala, 1959, you don't like what's happening there, dismiss the government. Was there really a liberal organizational form? And I think this is an important question today for those of a liberal temperament, no longer merely just to mouth the pieties of liberalism, but what is the project of liberalism and what's its organizational form? So that's one set of questions. Actually, related to that is the second set of questions. I mean, I know in the second essay, at the very end, you say something which, gets said. You say, well, this is for another time. What do you mean when you say this is for another time? Well, exactly the most important issue. Because what have we seen? We have seen recently a terrible act of violence in Delhi. Terrible act of violence early this year. And then this government decides to go after sensitive people who are dissenting for the government, blaming these people for that act of violence, extraordinary act by this government, including the General Secretary of the CPIM, Sitaram Yechuri, Jayati Ghosh and so on. Rumors spreading, they will be arrested. But actually people have been arrested. Umar Khalid. Seriously? I mean, this is the person that you're going to charge with. So this terrible act of violence, then, we've seen an increase. The National Crime Records Bureau has seen an increase in suicides among day laborers. 23% last year of all suicides were day laborers. Of course, we know already, thanks to the reporting of Sainath, about the farmer suicides. A catastrophe for the working class and peasantry in India, a catastrophe. The way demonetization was done, the way in which now the lockdown was done, absolute callousness towards people who earn by the day, utter callousness of the government, no sign of a heart anywhere. And then these three bills, which, give power to traders, but we know that traders means giant agribusiness. It's not the Mandi fellows, this is big agribusiness that under the name trader is going to now completely take over Indian agriculture. Whatever barriers there were are being knocked aside. And the disgraceful behavior of the government in parliament, I, from my perspective, watching the video footage, I was struck by that. So the objective conditions, as you say at the end of that essay, the second essay, the objective conditions for an advance to something other than this atrocity in which we're living in, the objective conditions exist, but there is a subjective problem. And this comes to that question which you say, well, we'll have to pick this up at another time, which is, the question of the future of the left and how the left is going to be able to advance a subjective project in the middle of objectively this catastrophe, this atrocity in which people are living in, where the working class and the peasantry are experiencing a calamity daily. And yet our subjective capacity to transcend this moment just doesn't seem to exist. So I'd like you to reflect on these two themes. One is, again, just to recap, the question of the liberal project and the liberal organizational form. And secondly, the issue of the objective calamity in which we're living in and this subjective inability to, lift ourselves out of this moment. So these are two things which I think are there in the book, but I would just like you to pull them out a little more. As soon as you unmute, I shall mute myself.
Right, okay. I thought muting was being done from back there. Okay, very good, Vijay. Liberalism has been greatly overrated by everyone, including the left, thanks to our British colonial education. There is no such thing as a liberal project. Liberalism crashed on the shores of capitalism and imperialism. There is no liberal project except capital accumulation. That's just basic. I can quote Locke to you, I can quote all the great liberal thinkers and so on. The Enlightenment split two ways. Marxism, the radical Enlightenment went into Marxism. The rest of the Enlightenment went into liberalism. And the Enlightenment project crashed on that. Every liberal constitution in the world, without exception, gives the government of the day the right to abrogate the legal structures, the constitutional provisions. In the British tradition, it's called emergency powers. In the French tradition, it's called state of siege. Liberal governments arming themselves with the kind of laws that you are citing in relation to the Indian government is normal. That is the normal state of things under liberalism. The problem is that too many people, including on the left, and because you have a long liberal democratic tradition in India, have come to believe that there are certain norms that liberalism does not exceed, and when it exceeds, then there is a problem. No, the normal life of liberalism is this. There's nothing abnormal. You see it in the United States. Killing of a black person every week out in the open is a norm, etc. So communal violence, these extraordinary laws, these dismissals of governments, this enduring state of emergency in places like Kashmir and so on is the liberal norm. It is only when these norms are formally abandoned, that you get either dictatorship or fascism. So long as, so the liberal constitution itself allows you so much. Liberal constitution allows you to pass bills even if the entire opposition has walked out. It is not contrary to liberal constitutionalism. Whatever this government is doing is legal. They have laws under which Umar Khalid and tomorrow maybe Sitaram Yechuri will be arrested. They have norms, they have laws. They have the Supreme Court of India upholding those rights. The higher judiciary, you go to the higher judiciary with these very cases and you see what happens. This is what I meant when I say long march through the institutions. The liberal institutions and the relationship between these liberal institutions and the authoritarian core of the RSS project is in place. So no, liberalism has no project other than infinite accumulation, infinite exploitation of people around the world. And the more grave this class polarization becomes, the more violent liberalism will become. And you're absolutely right. The Tories Noam Chomsky says quite rightly that the Republican Party is the most dangerous single institution in the world, which is the ruling party of the United States. So I despise liberalism. I despise it. They have no project that we can talk about. And you're quite right. In that sense of this ideal notion of liberalism, Congress was never liberal. But that's only in this ideal notion. Otherwise, Congress was the heart of Indian liberalism. It did all of those things which liberalism does. So that's my take on that. I despise the damn thing. And it has been one of our two antagonists have been fascists and liberals. Social democracy went with imperialism, which was the highest form of liberalism. Social democracy was the highest form of liberalism once it broke with Marxism. And it went with imperialism rather than with the communists. The history would have been completely different if they did not, without their act of betrayal. So that was, this, what you said at the end, that ending of the essay, that actually, when I said that is for another time, that didn't have anything to do with my writing on how to build a left alternative. That actually had to do with the fact that that particular essay is a version of a chapter in a book that I am trying to write these days. So I was referring to other parts of that book that I'm going to. The left project, I think, that I am not competent to actually lay out what the left needs to do. About that, I feel very, very, very incompetent. Sitting in your armchair and talking about how to build the global left. And I've also become just very old. I wish I was young and engaged as you are. It is for you to figure out. So that is your job. How to build a left movement. I have a very modest ambition, which is caught in a moment of crisis in history. How do I understand that moment? Its past and its possible futures. To look at the structure of that which exists. And for the rest, of course, you have to build communism. How you do it is not something I'm going to write articles about. There are people far more competent than me who can address that question.
Just one thought more, Comrade Chandramohan, and I know you want to, I'm not sure we're going to take questions, correct? There may not be time.
I think some people, some may ask, I think just we will post we will tell them to, if anybody is there, we'll ask them.
I just want to emphasize something that Ejaz Ahmed just said. He said, I have a very modest ambition, which is to explain the structure of the way things are. Just like to underline that. There's a reason why an essay, as Ram said, an essay written in 2004, 2005 can be republished in 2020, and it feels like it was written, as you're reading it, in fact, is because I think that essay, the first essay in this book, captures very well the structures, through which India is transpiring. It's not an essay written of the conjuncture alone. It captures the structures, and for which reason, it's not a dated essay. I mean, I reread this essay just a few hours ago, and I felt this is an essay that explained it. As I said, it felt like I was reading it as it was being written. It's a Google Doc shared on the screen, and Ejaz Ahmed is typing it, and I'm reading it as he's writing it. And it feels like that because it does grasp the nettle, the structure, through which India is going at this time. And I think that's the reason why I highly recommend for people get a hold of this book. It's going to help you understand, some of the things that are happening now. A parallel book with this is Nurani Saab's The RSS book, From Leftward, Menace to India, which Ejaz has reviewed in the London Review of Books. It's a tour de force. Comrade Chandramohan, what's the next step in our agenda?
May I say that, Vijay, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
May I say that the journey of my friend Ghafoor Nurani from the ideological position is remarkable. That's really worth researching, because he's come a long way. And the sheer richness, the depth of his study of these phenomena and trends, I think, takes your breath away. So he's, I think, one of the very notable case of somebody who's drawn to evidence, what is happening, and almost unnoticed, it carries him across the spectrum, ideological spectrum. Have you thought about that?
Well, you have been his editor for much of his career since, Frontline launched in the 1980s. And in Frontline, one has seen him essentially surf the dialectic of, the rise of a certain kind of right. And I mean, because of Frontline, one has traced and tracked the more legalistic writings, and then Ayodhya comes. And there is a visible shift in his prose after Ayodhya, I feel, having read him from, I think, 1984. I think he was writing in Frontline from the beginning. Am I wrong?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much, yes.
Yeah, and after Ayodhya, I don't know if you agree with me, but the tone of his writing shifts. And then, of course, Gujarat, the pogrom in Gujarat changes the tone of his writing greatly.
Yes, and remarkably bold, courageous, I think, is to what he says. I really am an admirer of his work. There's only one phrase that I changed as editor of Frontline. He had objected to it, thinking the desk had done it, but I had actually done it. I'll tell you off camera what it was. But
India wants to know, as Arnab Goswami says, India wants to know, the nation wants to know.
And he accepted it sportingly, but I'll tell you off camera. I'll tell Aijaz also.